Now, I rarely use it, Understanding Twitter's Evolving Accessibility to Blind Users, presented by Meredith Ringel Morris.
Hi, good morning. I'm Meredith Ringel Morris from Microsoft Research, and today I'll be talking about work with several co-authors, Annuska Zolyomi, Catherine Yao, Sina Bahram, Jeff Bigham, and Shaun Kane. And I'll be talking about how Twitter's accessibility to blind users has evolved, and I'll do my best to try to describe verbally any visual material on the slides in case there's anyone in the audience who has trouble seeing. So this slide shows an image of the Twitter account of my co-author, Sina Bahram. So Sina is blind, and he uses Twitter. For many of you in the audience, you might wonder whether people who are visually impaired use social media. And indeed, they do. And Twitter, in particular, has been traditionally rather heavily used by people who are blind because historically it had a very simple text-based interface. And so in this work, we explore how the rise of importance of embedded multimedia in social media platforms is changing Twitter's usability for people who are blind, and what might be done about that to enable full participation in our modern society in which using social media is an important part for people with visual impairments. So the research questions we explored in this work are, first, understanding what blind users' goals are in engaging with Twitter so that we can better understand what barriers might exist to achieving these goals and how we might change the design of technology to better facilitate those goals. We also want to understand how people who are blind are currently using Twitter. Does their use differ from sighted users? And if so, does this represent important accessibility issues that ought to be fixed? Can we determine from someone's Twitter profile whether or not they have a visual impairment, and does that represent an important privacy or legal issue that social media platforms should be concerned about? And finally, we think about how Twitter's accessibility is evolving over time. Twitter began as a very accessible platform, and that has been changing, and it's interesting to think in general about how platforms' accessibility status may evolve over time and what providers can do to prevent that from happening. So I had some fun with the Internet Wayback Machine, and this slide shows a screenshot of Twitter in 2006, and when Twitter first began. And what's noticeable about this screenshot is that all the tweets are just text. So the only images are people's profile pictures, right? But there's no images embedded in tweets, so it's very simple. And even in this screenshot from 2010, even here, this is showing a picture of the top tweets, the most popular trending tweets. And again, only profile pictures, the most popular trending tweets. Everything is still all text. So if you are visually impaired and you are using a screen reader to access your computer, which just reads all the text out loud to you, you can consume Twitter with a screen reader device fairly easily. Then in 2011 is when things began to change. So this is a screenshot of Jack Dorsey's post on the official Twitter blog on June 1st, 2011, when he announced that now you can tweet images. So you can embed photos directly into your tweets, and of course, that was an important change. So now, today, this is a screenshot of Twitter from a couple of weeks ago of the most popular trending tweets, and every single one of them has an image embedded into it. And of course, these are not consumable by a screen reader. So if you use a screen reader and you're surfing the web, for example, if you encounter an image on a web page, if the web developer has been compliant with accessibility standards, they will have used the alt tag on the web page to provide a verbal description as an alternative caption for the photo, and your screen reader will read that aloud. But if you're like most web developers, you probably haven't done that, and then the screen reader won't give you any information. And until just a few weeks ago, Twitter actually didn't even have the capability to add alt text to photos at all, even for people who wished to be compliant. So if you are trying to consume these tweets with your screen reader, you will hear the text of the tweet, but you won't hear any description of the image itself. And so is this important? So one thing that we did as part of this research was we have access to the full Twitter fire hose. And so we downloaded millions of tweets from the past year and a half. And this image is showing a graph of the percentage of tweets that have embedded media starting in January 2014 and going through the summer of 2015, so over a year and a half period. And the important thing to get from this graph is that these lines are trending up, right? So the percentage of tweets with embedded images is rising. About a quarter of tweets now have pictures embedded in them. And then the top line is showing retweets. So retweets, which in some sense are the most popular or important tweets that people are resharing, as of last summer when we measured, now nearly 45% of retweets contain images embedded in them. So if you can't see, you're missing in some sense almost half of the most popular content on Twitter, and that seems to be a problem. And so there was no way to even add alt text to Twitter at the time we did this research, although I am pleased to say that on March 29th, Twitter did announce that they have now added the capability, at least in their iPhone interface, for people who wish to do so to attach alt text to images and tweets. So that is a good start to rectifying some of these issues, although it does remain to be seen to what degree people will actually be compliant with and use this feature. That's not something that we have data on at this time. So in this study, we wanted to collect data about how blind users are using Twitter. So during a 2-week period, we conducted an online survey of blind Twitter users. So we advertised the survey on Twitter via promoted tweets. And of course, if you're buying ads to promote your tweets on Twitter, you can't just select, show my tweets to people who are blind. That's not a demographic breakdown they give you. So we tried advertising by advertising, for example, to people who followed accounts for organizations like the National Federation of the Blind or different guide dog organizations, et cetera, as a way to target our survey toward those users. We got 132 valid survey responses. And as part of the survey, in addition to asking people questions about their experiences and goals as a blind user of Twitter, we also made clear to participants that we would be gathering their Twitter handles as part of the survey and then crawling their Twitter profiles and public tweets to actually gather the behavior. And so of the 132 survey responses that were from blind Twitter users, only 116 of them had public Twitter profiles. The rest had private profiles. So we only crawled the data on the fire hose for those 116 users. And then we also gathered 116 control accounts of users who we are fairly confident are not blind via a manual verification process that we describe in the paper. Of course, there's always some minute possibility that these people could be blind and escaped our notice somehow. So from the survey data, the motivations for blind people in our sample to use Twitter partially overlap with the motivations of course, everyone who uses Twitter, to become informed of news and current events, to be entertained, to socialize with their friends and family. But there were also another subset of goals that related specifically to blindness. So people wanted to learn about research and issues specifically related to blindness. They wanted to participate in public advocacy related to blindness. They wanted to specifically meet new people who were also blind. So we see some goals that overlap with mainstream users and some goals specific to this constituency. Again, just to highlight the importance, why is it important that social media be accessible to people who are blind? I was really touched by this quote from one of the survey participants who said, "In an increasingly visual culture, it's vital that people with visual impairments have equal access to information on social media. One of the most frustrating experiences I encounter is sitting down after a long day of work to scroll through my tweets and have a few laughs with my friends, only to realize that an article I want to read or a picture or video my friend has tweeted is inaccessible." So one thing we did as part of our data collection was we went through the 116 blind and 116 controlled Twitter profiles and manually recorded information about the profile page. So this slide shows an image of just a sample Twitter profile page where you can see there's space for a profile picture where people might often include, say, a headshot of themselves. In this example, it's showing the default. So if you don't upload your own profile picture, you're just shown the egg. I think it's supposed to be like the Twitter bird before it hatches, right? So if you have the default, you have an egg. Below the egg is a space to fill out your bio. So you're allowed to write a short bio. I think it's about 160 characters where you can say things about yourself, like mine says, I'm a computer scientist, I work for Microsoft Research, etc. And then the big blue banner space behind the profile picture is the header image. So this is an optional second image that people can upload to further decorate and personalize their profile. And if it's the default, it's just this plain blue rectangle like you see in the picture. And so we manually classified things about these Twitter accounts. So first we examined whether people's bio field mentioned that they had a visual impairment. So of the people who were blind, 20% of them just had a completely blank bio. They hadn't filled it out at all. Another 20% clearly identified as they were blind. So they would say things like, went blind in November 2012, or I'm a chocoholic who also happens to be blind, or I'm a blind sports writer. And then another 25% didn't clearly state that they were blind, but they would say something that hinted that they might be blind. So they'd say, I'm a Braille transcriber by trade, or I'm a seeing eye grad who's not currently working a dog. And then the remaining third didn't have any indication of their vision status in their profile. Another thing we looked at was the profile image, whether it was the default egg or whether it had been customized. For control users who we believe are sighted, 99% of them had customized their profile image. For people who were blind, only 57% of them had customized their profile image. So that's a statistically significant difference. It's quite large. And then we also looked at this supplementary header image. Again, 83% of the control users customized their header image, but only 11% of people who were blind did. Again, a significant difference. Now, this may represent for some people just a lack of interest in imagery. Imagery may not be important to them. And a couple of blind respondents to our survey mentioned that they had explicitly not chosen to upload a picture because that wasn't important to them. But for the most part, most people in our survey indicated that they either weren't even aware that these profile fields existed on the page because the page was so difficult to use, or they were aware the fields existed but just couldn't figure out in the interface how to customize it by themselves via a screen reader because the accessibility was quite poor. We also looked through the Twitter fire hose at differences between the blind and control accounts in the way they use Twitter. So blind users had significantly older accounts than people in our sample, which jives with prior research that people who were blind tended to be early adopters of Twitter because of its historical accessibility. Blind users had fewer followers when normalized for account age. This also jives with prior research on Facebook showing that blind users tend to have smaller online social networks than sighted users. Not surprisingly, blind users rarely send tweets with embedded images. So a quarter of the tweets sent by control accounts contained imagery, but only 5% of blind users' tweets contain imagery. Blind users also retweet much less than control users. This might be related to the fact that, as we saw earlier, tweets that contain embedded imagery are more likely to be retweeted. So blind users might be having less exposure to these popular tweets. And blind users were somewhat more likely to have geolocation turned on their accounts. So this is a feature that reports from the information on your phone where you are when you tweet. And past work, like by Brent Hecht, has shown that on social media, many people choose to obscure their geolocation for privacy reasons. So again, this may represent that blind users don't have as complete access to the ability to control the privacy features in their accounts that people who are sighted do. And so another thing we also looked at, we did some manual examination of the hashtags that the blind and control users have in their tweets, the most popular hashtags. And what we see is for control users, the most popular hashtags related to memes like Throwback Thursday, Women Choose Wednesday was another popular one. And these memes typically involve tweeting pictures, right? On Throwback Thursday, you tweet an old school picture of yourself, and on Women Choose Wednesday, I guess you pick a picture of tweet a picture of a woman you like. And then a lot of also sharing about popular news that's trending. So at the time we gathered data, this was when, for example, riots were happening in Ferguson. So we see that that's a very popular hashtag among the control users. But if you look at the top hashtags among the blind users, they relate to disability and technology. So the ally hashtag is an accessibility-related hashtag. We see blind, accessibility, accessibility audio. And so this may reflect some of the specific interests of this community, and we saw that blind users indicated that they were interested in advocacy for the blind on Facebook and meeting other people who are blind, but they also indicated that they were interested in news and entertainment and socializing, just like mainstream users, and we see that perhaps they might be being excluded from some of these popular interactions. We did some analysis. We have more details in the paper, looking at some of these different factors that I just discussed, like the frequency of tweeting images, whether or not your profile image is filled out. And we're able to develop a model that can classify correctly with over 90% accuracy whether someone is likely to be sighted or blind based on these features in their Twitter profiles and behavior. And this is, again, something that people who are blind may not be aware that can be done, right? Only about 40% of the blind users were explicitly or hinting to the fact that they were blind in their profile descriptions on their profile page. So that means that many of them may not want to necessarily reveal this information, and the fact that it can be inferred is perhaps problematic. If I were buying ads on Twitter to advertise financial services or job opportunities, I might be able to use this information to advertise differentiated things that may be less desirable, perhaps, to people who are blind. So another thing we looked at is the imagery on Twitter itself, to understand in more detail what non-sighted users might be missing, and to understand what technical solutions we need to develop in order to make this imagery more accessible. So here we did an analysis of 900 English language tweets that contained images that were tweeted in June of this year, and we manually classified, and again, you can read in the paper, we had multiple classifiers and we did all the inter-rater reliability and such that you would expect. But what you can see here is that the most common type of image tweeted is photos. When I think of images, I think of photos, but while they're the most common, photos only represent about 2/3 of the imagery that's being shared. So there's actually this long tail of many other types of imagery. So images with text embedded, like advertisements, just pictures of text. So one thing people do is it's called screenshotting. They'll take a picture of text to circumvent the 140-character limit on Twitter, and they'll tweet that picture. And of course, that's especially sort of sad in this case because it's taking content that could have been accessible, text, and turning it into an inaccessible image. People tweet 7% of the images were screenshots of people's computers or phones. Another 5% were drawings people made. Then you get graphs and memes. Another one here that's interesting is unofficial retweets. That one's similar to screenshots. What people do is rather than just use the official retweet mechanism to retweet something, which would at least make the text of that tweet accessible to a screen reader, for various reasons, many people choose to screenshot someone else's tweet and then embed that screenshot as an image with their own commentary, sometimes, again, to circumvent character limits or for other reasons that we get into in the paper. And this is important because a lot of the work that's being done right now on automated captioning of images, be it via computer vision, focuses mainly on photographs. And thinking about how to perhaps generate captions for these other types of imagery is important. So this slide is just showing some examples of those different categories of imagery that I just described. So one last thing I wanted to get to before we run out of time is we also analyzed things like, well, how important is the image to the tweet? Maybe if you only get the tweet text and not the image, you're still hearing important things. And it turns out that in almost all cases, the image is very important because the tweets themselves would not actually serve as useful captions. So only in about 11% of cases does the text of the tweet serve as a useful caption. And to understand why it's not, in this slide I have a picture of a tweet of Justin Bieber. So many tweets with pictures of Justin Bieber, and the text just says sunshine, right? It doesn't say picture of Justin Bieber, which is what you would want to hear if you were using a screen reader. So I'll stop here and take questions, but what we can see, again, in conclusion, is that we see that blind users want to achieve the same goals on social media as sighted users, and in addition, have some additional goals specific to the blind community. And so allowing alt text, as Twitter began to do a few weeks ago, is an important step toward allowing this. But understanding how to increase compliance with this feature is important. So one, in the paper, you can check out some of our design suggestions, but one idea, for example, is that if people aren't using the alt text feature well, you could imagine that you could have an automated system that identifies the most popularly retweeted tweets that contain images and use that to direct volunteer efforts to let them add alt text to those popular tweets so that those would begin to become more accessible. So I'll stop and I'll take any questions you have. Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you, okay, it was really interesting what you have presented us here, but do you have any solutions?
Sorry?
Solutions? Any solutions to the problem?
Right, so solutions to the problem. So one, as I said, Twitter's allowance of alt text is an important step forward, allowing ways to automatically generate that alt text. So, Facebook has introduced a really interesting feature just recently where they use computer vision to begin to generate, while not a full caption, some information about embedded imagery in social media. So they might create an automated alt text that says something like, this picture is likely to contain a child and a dog. And that, I think, is an important way that can be used to circumvent some of people's poor compliance with these standards. I think one thing that's important with techniques like that is thinking about how you can convey to the end user who can't see whether or not the computer vision algorithm was correct in its guesses, some sorts of user understandable confidence metrics for how well they can trust those techniques. But I'd be happy to stick around afterwards and talk about it more. Thanks.